Okay, we are continuing our survey of the Old Testament. We are necessarily have gotten slowed down in the book of Genesis. I think that's appropriate. Very important book. Trying to make connections. This week we're going to look at Tamar and Judah in Genesis 38 and see how far we can get, hopefully, into the Joseph narrative. Now, I encourage everybody to fasten your seat belts. This is one of those stories and chapters that does not get a lot of attention, and you'll see why as we get into it. But these stories are not in here by accident. And, we are polite in church and we like to avoid troublesome issues. And the Old Testament especially, but the whole Bible, has passages in it that are difficult. And sometimes we do ourselves a real disservice to not study these difficult passages. We'll get out and we'll get to talking about the Bible with somebody, and they'll ask us about these passages for good or ill. Their intentions sometimes are bad, and it's not good when we have no idea what they're talking about. When we call ourselves Christians, biblical Christians, and we have no idea. So hopefully we can educate ourselves on Genesis 38. So now, just in review, we've been going through the big sections of hitting the high points of the book of Genesis. The first 11 chapters starts with creation, and it's kind of looking at how the whole world looks. The Creator, God, created everybody, and He is God for everybody. In chapter 12, it narrows down, and we have a long extended section with Abraham and his son and grandson. We call them the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we looked at Jacob last time and the real mess of his household. We looked at the story of Genesis 34, just an awful story where the daughter Dinah goes out running around, and it seems, kind of running wild. So she's doing bad. She gets grabbed and taken hostage and defiled by Shechem, a Canaanite, and he wants to negotiate to keep her. Jacob gets really passive in the story, and the sons, her brothers, sons of Leah, take over and negotiate, trick the Canaanites, and kill all of them, massacre. Then the other brothers come in and loot the city. Just an ugly story. And this is an ugly story we'll see today. And so the greater question is, we believe the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit, so these stories are in there for a reason. What's that reason? What is the commonality? So let's dig in to Tamar and Judah here in Genesis 38. And some of these questions and some of these brutal things will show themselves, and we'll deal with it. So last week we looked at Genesis 34 and the catastrophe at Shechem. Jacob was passive in his role as father. The week before we had looked at how he was not decisive. Well, he was willful to get what he wanted and created a mess. His household was a mess. And so in part, Genesis 34 was a continuation of Genesis 30, where Jacob did not seek God's will, and he had too many wives, and his house was a train wreck, and his kids were mixed up, and we see that play out in Genesis 34, where he was very passive. Everybody in Genesis 34 behaved badly. And we ended with a question: how does Genesis 34 relate to Genesis 38? So here we go on Genesis 38. I hinted last week that the connection might have to do with the seed. And so let's review. This is to me, and I'll tip my hand a little bit, following the seed is the key to unlocking Genesis, and why all these stories are put together in the way they are. All the way back to Genesis 3, the woman had eaten the apple and given to her husband, and he had eaten. after being tempted by the serpent. Then God turned and began giving consequences for people's actions, including the serpent. To the serpent he said, "And I will put enmity or hostility between you and the woman." And this is going forward, thinking in this case of her as the prototype woman, the first woman, if you will. I'm going to put enmity between serpents and women. Women generally don't like snakes. That's not. Ellie will send us a picture occasionally with her holding a snake. I'm like, no, thank you. But I think a greater idea here is I'm putting enmity between the evil that the serpent represents and the descendants of the woman, mankind, and between your seed and her seed. So forevermore, there's going to be enmity between the serpent and mankind. And he, the seed of the woman, shall bruise your head. Now, let me say, and I've said it to you many times, this term seed, zerah in Hebrew, is masculine singular. Like he is masculine singular. He is not many people. He is one person. Now, it is legitimate speaking, when we're speaking metaphorically, it is legitimate to say descendants often for seed, and you'll always see it, and I will point those out. But the term used for seed is the term literally means male offspring. All right. He shall bruise your head. The head is the top, the most important part. Ultimately, the seed of the woman will win a victory. Now, I'll just tell you, the seed of the woman, I think, has a double meaning. It is the descendants of the woman, but it's talking about Jesus. And so we're going to track the seed from here on. Ultimately, Jesus will win a victory over evil. And you, the serpent, and your descendants, shall bruise his heel. Evil is going to be with mankind from now on until the end of time. And it's going to be a constant annoyance. It's going to be following after. It's going to be trying to master mankind from now on. Then we jump forward to Abraham being called by God. God says, "Go where I tell you, and I will make your name great." Then in chapter 7 it said, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants," again, that's a legitimate translation, but what it says in Hebrew is seed, your masculine singular seed. He, to him I will give this land. This land where there is relationship between God and man. I think it's the promised land is where the Garden of Eden is. My wish, I will give it to the seed so that he can return you to fellowship with me. So Abram built an altar there to Yahweh who appeared to him. Then in chapter 17, God came back. This is where Abraham laughs in the face of God when God tells him that he's going to have a male descendant, but from his body and Sarah's body. God says, "I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed, your descendant." And that is, again, that's the Israelites, but it's also talking about Jesus. After you, your descendants after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, an eternal covenant, to be God to you and to your seed after you, your descendants after you. So you see, we're tracking the seed. Chapter 21, Genesis 21, God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed of the lad and your maid," that is Hagar and Ishmael, and the trouble and him having to send them away. What Sarah tells you concerning Ishmael and Hagar, listen to her. "For through Isaac your seed shall be named." Okay, so tracking the seed from the woman down to Abraham and Sarah. They have Isaac and Rebekah. Through Isaac, your seed shall be named. So the line of descendancy, the kingly line, goes through Isaac, not Ishmael. Now in the New Testament, Paul that gives us an interpretation of what was said in the Old Testament. In Galatians, the letter to Galatia, chapter 3, verse 16, Paul says, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and his seed. He does not say two seeds. So Paul, who knows Hebrew very well, is giving you the same interpretation that I am of the Hebrew. He said to the seed, not to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one. To your seed I give this promise, that is Christ. So that's just plain as the nose on your face, Paul makes it. Back to Genesis 22. This is a story where God tests Abraham and asks him to sacrifice Isaac after waiting. We get to verse 16. Yahweh said, by myself I've sworn, because you have done this thing and not withholding your son, your only son. Very important. Indeed, I will greatly bless you. God's intention from the beginning was to bless mankind. And here he is repeating, through your son, your only son, I will bless, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand of the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Now, this is, again, referring to God is working a plan through the Israelite people. But that plan is about a masculine, singular individual, Jesus, who will be born into the Israelites. The role of the Israelites is to be a people of God, to be sanctified, so I assume so that Jesus is not born into a polytheistic family. That is the purpose of the Israelites. All through that seed, all the nations of the earth will will have the opportunity to have a relationship with God. Not just the Israelites. That's problematic for the Israelites. They wanted to be the only ones, I think, by observation. But that was never God's intention, to only have a relationship with the Israelites. Jump into Genesis 24, verse 34. So to Laban, so he said, now this is Eleazar, Abraham's servant. Abraham sent him to get a wife for Isaac. So Eleazar said to Laban, I am Abraham's servant. Yahweh has blessed my master greatly, and he's given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, many servants and livestock. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore him a son, Isaac, when he was old. Now my master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the Canaanites, from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house and my family, and take a wife for my son, that is Rebekah. Later in that chapter it says, and they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, may you become the mother of thousands, of 10,000s, and may your descendants, your seed, possess the gates of those who hate them. That is, thrive in spite of enemies, rise to the top. Several chapters later, Leah is introduced as we're tracking the seed. So far, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and now we get down to Jacob, who is carrying the seed. And Leah conceived again and bore a fourth son, and said, now I will praise Yahweh. So she called his name Judah, which means praise. So the seed of descendancy, the blessed seed, the coming Messiah goes through Judah. Now it gets interesting in Genesis from this point forward, because we are right, and Genesis 38 is a little interlude as we start talking about Joseph. So the rest of the book of Genesis is about Joseph, except for this very strange story about Judah. Why is it here? How does it fit in? How does it maybe connect to Genesis 34? That's the question we're asking. And about Judah, it says at the end of Genesis, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh, peace, comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Okay? So the kingly blessing. This is, Joseph is already in the picture. We know that Jacob loves Joseph the most. Joseph is an important man, and Joseph has saved the Israelites at this point. They were going to die of hunger without Joseph, but he gives the kingly blessing to Judah. In Psalms 60, verse 7, and same thing in Psalms 108a, it says, Judah is my scepter. Yahweh says in the poem, Judah is my scepter, my chosen king. So who is Joseph? Well, in 1 Chronicles 5:2, it says this. This is very interesting to me. Knowing that Judah is the kingly line, the chronicler points out, though Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came the leader, yet the birthright of Reuben, the firstborn son, belonged to Joseph. I find that very interesting. So there is an important role that Joseph says. And according to the chronicler, Joseph is the firstborn, has the birthright of the firstborn, the double portion. He does have two sons, and both his sons become part of the 12. So Joseph becomes two tribes when they get to the promised land. And so I want to come back. I want to get to Genesis 38, and then I want to come back to Joseph as we go through. I think Joseph, and I'll just go ahead and tell you what I think. I think that Joseph represents God's relationship with the Hebrew and the Israelites. I think Joseph is Israel. And so all the good things that are said about Joseph are in contrast to his brothers. I think Joseph represents Israel, the Israelites, the Jews now. The Jews are the fragment that is left of the Israelites. And Judah and the other brothers represent who? Well, Judah himself is Messiah, but is Messiah only Messiah for the Israelites? No, he's the Messiah for everybody. And so the brothers represent Gentiles, and Judah is in with the brothers. So he represents God's relationship with all people. That's what I think. And I think that's why so many good things are said about Joseph. So see what you think as we go through. There are also some very troubling things that are said about Joseph. I doubt we'll have time to highlight those. But Joseph also does several things that make you say, do what? So Joseph gets a good rap, but Joseph wasn't perfect. Now we have some questions to ask about Judah. As I said, is there a connection between Genesis 34 and 38? Let's dig into 38. And if we get to stuff that you want to, you can put your head down and cover your ears up if it's bothersome to you here. It came to pass, Judah departed from his brothers. This is after the whole thing of Shechem and before we get into all the Joseph narratives. Joseph was introduced in the previous chapter, chapter 37. Then we have this strange interlude, and then everything else is about Joseph and Egypt. So he left his brothers and saw a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. So the daughter of Shua, a Canaanite. What do we know about getting Canaanite wives? Is that good or bad? So right away, Judah is doing a rebellious thing. Judah's not perfect. And he married her. So she conceived and bore a son, and they called his name In contrast, and I'm going to just, because we're going into Joseph next, I'm grabbing little pieces of Joseph and just contrast. You know, Joseph is a good-looking man, it says. He gets to slavery in Egypt. He is Potiphar's house servant and runs the household. Potiphar's wife gets after Joseph, grabs his coat. He pulls his coat off and runs out without his shirt on, and because she begs him to go have an affair with her, and so he's morally good. But Judah seeks a Canaanite pagan wife, reminds you of Esau, reminds you of Samson, and so there's a little bit of a about Judah, which is interesting. There's a lot of good things said about Judah, but this makes you scratch your head a little bit. So the daughter of Shua conceived again after and bore Onan. Onan means strength, power, vigor. She conceived yet again and bore a third son, and his name was Shelah. Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Now, we don't know anything about Tamar. And I used to think that Tamar was an Israelite. I'm not so sure. I think that maybe Tamar is Israelite, but it doesn't say. I will point out that she is the first Israelite. If she is a Hebrew, she is the first Hebrew woman mentioned after Dinah in Genesis 34. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of Yahweh, not specific on what his wickedness was, and Yahweh caused him to die, is what it says in Hebrew, which we would say killed, but there's a different word for killed, caused him to be dead. Judah said to Onan, go, and this is a strange custom, it's called Levirate marriage. Levirate is a Latin term where the brother marries. When a brother dies, his brother will marry his wife and then have a child by her or by him, and it's considered the firstborn son's heir. We see that in the book of Ruth. That is what Boaz does for Naomi and Ruth. He is a Levirate husband. So he says to Onan, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir for your brother. So where does Levirate marriage come from? In Deuteronomy 25 in the laws of Moses, 5 and 6, when brothers live together and one dies and has no son, wife of the deceased shall not marry outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as a wife, perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. The firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of the dead brother. Very strange custom, alluded to in several places in the Bible. It's one of those customs that we don't have hard evidence ever happened. I'd use the example of the year of Jubilee, where property returned to the original family that owned it, so that property would not pass out of the hands of the Israelites and would not pass out of a family. There's no evidence that they ever celebrated a year of Jubilee, so it becomes something of a symbolic thing. I would say the same thing about Levirate. I'm sure it's happened, but it was not a common thing. Back to Genesis 38. But Onan knew, so he was thinking of himself, not of his duty to his family, not to his duty to God, not to his duty to Tamar. Now remember, in the background here is the seed. The seed passes through Judah and on down the line, down to Jesus. So somebody needs to impregnate Tamar to keep the line going. somebody in the family. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and he refused to impregnate Tamar. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord. So he killed him also. Then Judah got very scared that Tamar was bad luck. He's lost 2 sons. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow for now in your father's house, till my son Shelah is grown and can take you as a wife. For he said to himself, lest he also die like his brothers. So Judah here is being like Jacob, isn't he? He's being like the other brothers, sons of Leah. He's being a little bit deceitful. Judah has no intention to give Shelah as husband to Tamar. So Tamar is a widow. She has nothing other than her link to Judah's family as a way of making her way in the world. And we've talked about it before with the power differentials and the opportunities for women. And it's a simplification, but there are basically 3 jobs in the Old Testament for women. They can be a daughter and they eat at their father's hand. They can be a wife and they eat at their husband's hand, or they have to be a prostitute. They are destitute, and other than prostitution, they have no way to eat. That's an irony in this story, as you'll see. Judah is causing her, is eliminating some of her options to make a living. So it's interesting what she does. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. Now, in the process of time, Judah's wife died. Judah, it says, was comforted. That verb, nakam, is an interesting verb. There's a lot of ink been spilled about that, because in places the Bible says God nakam. And so the different things that I learned when I was learning Hebrew for that word nakam is to comfort, and we see that translated there, to console oneself, to do something to make yourself feel better. And that's what I think the intended word is here. And then the third meaning is to change your mind on things. And so, for example, in Exodus 32, when Moses comes down the hill and he hears a great noise like a battle, and the Israelites are down there worshiping the golden calf, God says, okay, I'm going to kill them. I'm going to wipe out the Hebrews. And he says, Moses, I want you to go and start a new group. We'll call them something else. I'm going to kill all the Hebrews. And Moses pleads to God and says, God, don't do that. What would the Canaanites say if you destroyed all the Hebrews? He said, if you have to kill somebody, kill me instead. So Moses was a great man. And it said, and God nakamed. God changed his mind and did not wipe out the Israelites. So I think the correct translation here would be Judah consoled himself, because he's not, to say his wife died and he was comforted makes it sound like he was glad to get rid of his wife. And we see by his behavior here, he's out running around with his buddy and he's looking for a prostitute. So he's consoling himself because his wife died. And he went to the sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And it was told to Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, like a prostitute would wear, and wrapped herself and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah, where prostitutes would sit for travelers. And she saw that Shelah was now grown, and she was not giving him as a wife. Okay? So, what do you think about Tamar?
It's cunning.
She is using her noggin, that's for sure. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Y'all are a little bit gun shy.
I'd say it's bad.
You think it's bad?
It was her only choice.
It seems to be her only choice. What should she do? Because she had seen that Sheila was grown and she had not been given him as a wife. Now, one big difference, there's some similarities here with the story with Rebekah. But we know that Rebekah had been told by God that Jacob was to rule over Esau. We don't have the same, Tamar is a little bit more difficult because we haven't been told that God had told her that the seed of descendancy had to come through her. And so we have to assume that. So if we assume, and I say if she suspects that the seed of descendancy must come through her, is she doing right or wrong? It's a hard question. But I believe, because this is a repeating theme throughout Genesis, the men lose faith, the men get scared, and they begin to make bad choices with the women, choices that jeopardize the seed. So I don't know what Judah knew. I don't fully know what Tamar knew, but I know that the men throughout Genesis, just about every one of them, jeopardize God's plan. They get fearful and they jeopardize God's plan. Here, Judah is fearful of losing his son. And so Judah is definitely doing wrong to withhold his son from Tamar. I don't know if Tamar knows if she's doing right or wrong, but Tamar is out of options. And as we will see in the story, she is almost killed for what she's about to do. She is a woman without power, completely and utterly without power in this situation. And so Judah has made a choice that destines her to be a widow, to be homeless, to be destitute, or to turn to prostitution. So it is very ironic, and you're supposed to catch the irony, that rather than accept Judah's wrong choice, she uses her cunning and pretends to be a prostitute, which is ironic because that's what Judah has forced her into by withholding the son. So it's a complex story, right? And it's challenging for modern people because we don't have the same customs, and aren't you glad? Aren't you glad? We don't make the same assumptions as we hear a story that an ancient person would in this story. But I say to you, especially because we've already been down this road, I believe that Tamar is like Rebekah. And we are meant to see the power differential between Tamar and Judah. She is utterly without power. Judah holds all the cards, and he has done wrong. I don't know if Tamar knew it, but we know it. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot because she had covered her face. Then he turned to her by the way and said, "Please come in, let me come into you, let me sleep with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. He thought she was a prostitute. Now, was it okay for him to sleep with her if she was a prostitute? No. We see, rather than saying, "Oh, by the way, reader of the Bible, Judah is sinning here," the way in a storytelling culture that they show that somebody does wrong is they get comeuppance. And Judah gets comeuppance here for what he's done. And so a person with the awful way that people that dislike the Bible try to attack it, you say, well, right there it's condoning, he's the line of descendants. He is an ancestor of Jesus, and he's sleeping with a prostitute. So the Bible is encouraging men to sleep with prostitutes. It is not. It is not. But it is a storytelling technique that does not give us a concrete list of all the things that people did. Storytelling expects the audience to be listening and to be writing things down in their mind and keeping score of things. So storytelling expects an intelligent audience that sees that he's doing wrong by the outcomes. So she said, what will you give me that you may come into me, that I will sleep with you as a prostitute? Well, how will you pay me? And he said, I will send a young goat from the flock. So she said, will you give me a pledge till you send it? He didn't have a goat with him. Will you give me a pledge? Then he said, what pledge shall I give you? So she said, your signet cord. And this would be whenever he would do a document or anything, how he would, it was a verification of his identity. And your staff that is in your hand. And I'm not greatly familiar with the custom. Some things I saw that seemed to indicate that there was a seal on his cane that identified him, and that they would put wax and he would roll his cane across the wax and it would imprint his seal on it. There was something of that nature to be wax and then an imprint that identified him. And so this is a signet ring here that somebody would have on their finger and imprint in clay, maybe wax or clay, to identify themselves in a document. Then he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived a child by him, actually a set of twins. So she arose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on her garments of her widowhood. Judah sent the goat by his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he did not find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, where's the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And they said, there was no harlot in this place. There's not, because a harlot normally would be expected to, be at the same place. And they're like, we've never seen one, because it was only a one-time event. About 3 months after, Judah was told, Tamar has played the harlot. That didn't ring a bell in his mind. we know, but he's like, oh, that's a bad thing. And she is with child by harlotry. Now, and there they mean sexuality outside the wedding bed. So thinking back to Dinah. If Dinah was consensual, then in the eyes of the Bible author, she had played the harlot. And so certainly the best you can say for Dinah was that she put herself in harm's way. She made a foolish choice. If she was consensual, she played the harlot. But there's no way around that sexuality outside the wedding bed was sinful. And that's very important because, like I say, the Old Testament doesn't give us lists. These things are sinful. And here's all the different ways you can think of to try to get out of it being sinful, that it's still sinful. They leave the door open for interpretation. So Judah was furious. Ironically, he had cast her aside and was not giving his son to her, but he was furious that she had gotten pregnant. Bring her out and let her be burned to death. So harlotry, sex outside of wedlock, for a woman was a death sentence. And again, power differential. It's very easy for us as modern people, where it's not a death sentence to get pregnant anymore. It's very easy for us to cast judgment on Tamar because cultures has changed so much. Tamar was out of options. When she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man to whom these signet rings and cane belong, I am with child. I was impregnated by the owner of this seal. She said, please determine who these are, the signet and cord and staff. And so, Judah was just fuming. He's like, set her on fire. Let's kill her right now. And she said, the man that slept with me, these are his identifying items. So Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous than I. Okay? And so we tend to indict Tamar, but this one is pretty easy. Within the story, she is acquitted for what she does. Because I did not give her to Shelah, my son. And he never knew her again. So they never slept together again. But she was pregnant. And it goes on to tell she had 2 sons, Perez and Zerah. And they did like, they fought in the womb like Jacob and Esau. Eventually, Perez was declared the older, and the line of descendancy went through Perez, and on down to Jesus. So far, the women in the line of Jesus is Sarah, who was barren, and Sarah, who lost faith in God and gave her handmaid to Abraham. We're still paying for that. Rebecca, who tricked Isaac into giving the blessing to the correct son, the son that God had told her. Leah, who was unfavored, unloved. She gave her handmaid. Then we have Dinah, who is not mentioned as a seed bearer, but the next woman mentioned. And then we have Tamar through Judah, who dressed like a prostitute and seduced her father-in-law. These are the women ancestors of Jesus. I think that's important. I think that's intentional. I think, again, Jesus came to save the lost. And I think the checkered pathway that brought Jesus to the world illustrates that point well. We cannot save ourselves. And there's an impossibility of righteousness because of sin. Only through Jesus can we get forgiveness for our sins. And I think it's implicit in the story there. So what did Judah do wrong? Anybody got an idea? Are y'all scared to say now?
Yeah.
Well,
He
he made a promise, but he didn't keep that promise, and he did not give the.
He withheld, and so he was. And again, we don't know if Judah knew that he was the line of descendancy. I mean, we know it, and so we're horrified. Like, Judah, you got to do your part. You've got to pass that seed down the line. But he withheld his son. And he says, I withheld my son. I'm in the wrong. And then he slept with a prostitute. And this story frowns upon that. What did Tamar do wrong?
She deceived her father-in-law.
She did. What if she didn't? What would have happened?
I guess the lineage would have been broken.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough question. It's a thought. The idea is to provoke thought. I believe she is the hero of this little episode. It's not endorsing what she did. Again, it's recognizing that she was out of options and she used cunning to continue the seed. And it's part of a greater picture, as I said, of men being passive and fearful and women having to step in, not in every case, and the women are doing wrong too in these stories, but the women having to step in and fix things for God's will to roll on. I had somebody one time challenge me. They were grading. It's when I was in school, and they were grading something I wrote about these stories, and they said women are always portrayed as bad, doing bad in biblical stories. And their point was, a very modern point, a feminist point. And I said that's not true. I said when women do bad and make wrong choices, they're treated as they're doing wrong. And when they do right, they are the heroes of the stories, which, by the way, is the same thing for the men. And in fact, most people in the Bible do wrong. I mean, the big greats so far, two greats, just three great. Who are the three greatest men in the Old Testament? Moses, Abraham, David, let's say. Just grab three. Did they ever do anything wrong? All three of them did lots wrong. And see, that's what's going on here. Throughout Genesis, the men make mistakes. They get fearful. They are passive and they refuse to trust God, but God's will rolls on. And unlikely characters step forward to keep God's will rolling along. And in this case, Tamar is the hero. It is not endorsing, to dress like a prostitute and seduce your father-in-law, but it is saying in this case, she was out of options and she stepped forward to keep God's will rolling forward. Again, this is why the Old Testament is challenging to people, because the culture is so different. But I would say to you what I said about Rebecca. If this story was told around the campfire in ancient times, they most likely would say, clever woman, clever woman. What is the key connection now with Genesis 34? And this is my opinion, so you may not get this. You may got an idea. That's an awful story. This was an awful story.
The lineage of the seed.
It's about the seed. I definitely think we've already decided that everybody did bad in Genesis 34. Why? Why was it bad? Why not mix with other people? Why not kill everybody? All those actions endanger the purity of the seed. And so, in my opinion, Dinah, there's a big block of text, and Dinah is the only Hebrew woman mentioned. Now, Dinah is not in the line of a seed bearer. She's in the family of seed bearers, but the seed that leads to Jesus does not go through Dinah. However, because there's a big block of text with no Hebrew women mentioned, to me, Dinah represents our daughters, the daughters of the Israelites, the daughters of the Israelite people. And we don't give away the daughters of the Israelite people into Pharaoh's harem. We don't give her into Abimelech's harem, which is what Abraham and Isaac have already done. And so she is representative of Hebrew motherhood, if you will, of the original mother, Mother Eve. She has a responsibility to the tribe to stay in, to marry with the tribe, and we need to protect her as the tribe. And so she represents a woman. The next Hebrew woman mentioned after Dinah is Tamar. And so I think I think Dinah is a link, a representative, a type, if you will. The literary term is a type that connects Rebecca to Tamar, or Leah, I guess in this case, Leah to Tamar. And so I think that is the connection. I think the key to all these odd stories is how God's will is to send a Messiah. And that the seed of the Messiah has been entrusted to Abraham and his descendants, and they keep doing things to mess up, to endanger God's will, God's seed in their life. Now, what's the lesson? Do we do that? Now, we're not talking about, we're not having babies because the Messiah is being born in us, but daily we are on mission for God, and we make choices that endanger God's will in our life and our witness and our purity, and we do things that dishonor God. And so we are no different than these people in these stories, even though they're in an ancient contrast. Now, so very quickly, there is a key contrast between Judah and Joseph. And in fact, Judah is not as stand-up a guy as Joseph is. We have no sultry stories about Joseph. And so I do believe as we go into the Joseph next week, the Joseph narratives, Joseph represents the Hebrews. And in general, they are virtuous and good. Judah represents God's connection with the whole world, including the Hebrews, in the coming seed. So think about that, and come back next week with questions as we start in on the Joseph stories. Any questions or comments as we get ready to close? Okay, let's say a prayer and be